In Lincoln, Nebraska, the skyline is home to a college football cathedral. For 100 years, Memorial Stadium has become a place that has bound the state together. The origins of this Nebraska landmark can be traced to a post-World War I America, eager to honor those who gave the ultimate sacrifice.
There was a national movement after World War I to build memorial structures. There were, 20 or 30 schools in the process of building a memorial building. It was a movement that kind of swept through academia from coast to coast.
They had really big plans for this building, right? And it was going to have the memorial, and that would be a rotunda area, colonnades. There would be a museum that you could put artifacts from the different war periods, because they'd started to think beyond just World War I. They were going to have, of course, the football field, indoor track. So it really became this giant thing.
Despite the initial designs and plans, in 1923, work began on just an east and west grandstand that would make up Memorial Stadium.
It's very labor-intensive to build a poured-in-place concrete building, which is exactly what the original Memorial Stadium is. It's the core of the stadium on the east and the west side.
The construction company had 89 days to complete the project. They lost 31 days to weather. It was an issue. So it went up pretty fast.
The design of the building is interesting in that it's very typical of its era. The late 19th and early 20th century saw architects and architecture in this country not exclusively, but heavily based in what is known today as neoclassical architecture. And here's where the Capitol and the stadium share some talent. The Capitol was started under construction a good year before Memorial Stadium was begun. And that was enough time to bring in a man from the university, a PhD philosopher and head of that department at the university in the 1920s by the name of Dr. Hartley Burr Alexander. He was brought into the team and provided all the inscription, some in painted murals, some carved in stone. He provided images of what the subject matter was to be in carvings on the outside of the building. He organized the entire thematic scheme, both on the exterior and the interior of the Capitol. He was asked by the university, you're doing this for the Capitol, how about providing some work for us at the stadium, which he was glad to do. There are 4 corner pavilions, and the 2 inscriptions on the east side of the building that face campus were dedicated as memorial statements to those who'd given their lives in service to the state and nation. In commemoration of the men of Nebraska who served and fell in the nation's wars. Their lives they held their country's trust. They kept its faith, they died its heroes. Since this facility was to be about sports as well, there were 2 inscriptions installed on the corner pavilions on the West Stadium. Not the victory, but the action, not the goal, but the game. In the deed, the glory, courage, generosity, fairness, and honor. And these are the true awards of manly sport. Anyone can build a stadium. What you put into it, what you say you stand for, is more a statement of who you are as a people. I mean, he darn well knew that. And so he chose statements on the face of the stadium, if you take time to read them, talk about the merit of the activities to go on inside the stadium. Not the win-loss record, but how you conduct yourself competing in those sports representing our state. The stadium was essentially an East and a West stadium. The East Stadium, that which faced campus, was to be the main entrance. The real visual appearance of the stadium was oriented to the east, as it should be, the campus, where the students would enter, and that's still to this day the predominant student and faculty side of the stadium. The West Stadium, more the general public. And so the East Stadium and West were both clad with a facade. It had a whole series of arches along the exterior face of the building, and at the very center of the east side was this semi-dome, which was a semicircular recess into the face of the stadium with a half dome at the top of it. It had kind of coffers in it and bosses or flowers in the center of that dome. So it had some real antecedents in Roman architecture. It was meant to be a very impressive, make no mistake about it, where the front entrance is kind of expression on that side of the building.
It was a really quick build, really, because you're talking that, they're groundbreaking in April of 1923, but they're playing games in October of 23. But again, that's where you had the field could be made available, certain sections of the stand could be available, but the entire stadium was not complete at that time.
It still had wood frame holding the concrete. It looked a little too fresh to be safe, but I do think they tested it before they let people sit up there in the stands.
And in fact, I think there's a note where Parsons Construction Company, that was responsible for actually building the stadium, they just said, if you're going to be having fans in the stands in October or on these games, we're not going to be responsible for any injuries. The first game happened on October 13th in 1923, and that was against Oklahoma.
Nebraska won that game fairly handily, I think 24-0 or something like that. And the interesting thing about that was that Nebraska wore blue jerseys that day because Oklahoma had only brought its red ones. And rather than have them, both teams looking the same, Nebraska agreed to, we'll do the blue jersey thing. So that's the only time that Nebraska ever didn't wear red in a game.
And then the next game on October 20th against Kansas and Jayhawks is when it was actually dedicated. And at that time, they said it was 30,000 fans could come into the stadium. Now, sometimes, depending on the archival record that you're looking at, you might see that read as 31,000. And in fact, at one point, I found a citation where there was actually 47,000 possible seats in the stands because the intention was that you could bring in bleachers in an emergency situation.
Nebraska had begun a new chapter on campus and within the football program. Even though the stadium wasn't quite finished, the first games played inside ushered in an era of winning football that only grew from there.